2021, the highest level since 2017. This critical achievement must be sustained amid the increasing severity of humanitarian needs. Early and adequate funding of the $190 million 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan is needed to continue to meet the urgent needs of 1.8 million vulnerable people, including over 1 million in government-controlled areas and 750,000 in non-government controlled areas. Mr. President, for the war-weary people of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts, the impact of COVID-19 on top of the conflict has caused even more grave disruption and suffering. Millions of people who prior to the pandemic could still maintain family and community connectivity have been unable to travel freely across the contact line due to COVID-19 related restrictions. As a consequence of their increased isolation and abrupt loss of access to basic services and livelihoods, the needs of this already vulnerable population have been exacerbated. At the same time, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continues to document civilian casualties and the impact of hostilities, monitor freedom of movement, and receive and report on allegations of human rights violations. Despite the persistent tensions, last year saw the lowest number of civilian casualties documented by OHCHR since the beginning of the conflict. Overall adherence to the ceasefire has been an important factor in this trend. It must continue. Mr. President, over 14,000 people have already lost their lives in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. As the Secretary General said this week, we simply cannot accept even the possibility of a new conflict in Ukraine. Indeed, we are facing a test. The world is looking to the collective security mechanisms in Europe, but also to this Council to help ease tensions and ensure that the only skirmishes will be diplomatic. We cannot afford to fail. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю госпожу Розмари Ди Карло за ее брифинг. И сейчас предоставляю слово его превосходительству господину Мика Кинунину.
The TCG supports implementation of the settlement provided by the Minsk agreements. However, in times like these, it is impossible to address the Donbas issue without paying attention to the bigger context, which is the tense security situation around Ukraine and in the region, as well as the intensive high-level diplomacy. Arguably, this bigger context has a strong interlinkage with the work of the Trilateral Contact Group. This argument is based on views according to which finding a solution to the main task of the TCG, implementation of the Minsk agreements, could help in solving many of the issues of the bigger picture. However, presently, positions of the participants to the discussions of the TCG are too far from each other. Consequently, as of now, it is not yet possible to solve the conflict related to eastern Ukraine within the TCG. We need to continue our work. At the same time, it is important to note that all the elements of the three Minsk agreements are relevant and need to be addressed. These agreements, Minsk Protocol, Minsk Memorandum, and the Minsk package of measures continue to form the basis of our work. It is crucial that all sides will continue to remain committed. It is popular to accuse one or another participant to the discussions for violating Minsk agreements or for not wanting to implement Minsk agreements. Here, my message would suggest caution. The fact is that none of the elements of the Minsk agreements has been implemented, or at least fully implemented. Furthermore, in my experience, it is not possible nor appropriate to single out only one party for being responsible for this. Everyone involved in the discussions of the trilateral contact group needs to bear their responsibility for carrying out what has been agreed. We need more flexible positions and readiness to compromise. Mr. President, security situation along the 480 kilometers long contact line that separates government-controlled area from the non-government-controlled area of eastern Ukraine is one of the key focuses of the work of the TCG. In the present situation, particularly with reference to the bigger contexts, it is important to continue to stay calm also along the contact line. Provocations are to be avoided. At the end of the day, no one would benefit from new military activities. Concrete press example of a potentially provocative situation is the alleged shelling that occurred this morning in Luhansk region, close to the contact line. It is important to try to establish facts in a swift manner and to avoid escalation. One participant to the discussions of the TCG has requested for an extraordinary TCG meeting. Armed conflict related to eastern Ukraine is 8 years old, as referred by the Undersecretary General. The conflict continues, has resulted in over 14,000 victims, hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees. Crossings over the contact line have dropped, civilian crossings, by 95% since the closing of checkpoints 2 years ago, resulting in additional civilian suffering and hardship. Conflict-affected areas with ongoing military activities have sadly become part of everyday life for countless Ukrainian citizens. In late December 2021, 2 months ago, participants to the discussions of the trilateral contact group agreed fully to adhere to the ceasefire agreement of July 2020. This New Year's commitment 2 months ago did not hold well enough. However, the positive side of the matter was, for 1 month period following the commitment, there were 70% less ceasefire violations than during the month before. This once again indicates if there is political will, it is possible not to use arms, possible not to fire. True, there have been small positive steps with our work, such as creation of an environmental expert group. Recent IAEA visit to the non-government controlled area shows that when there is will on all sides, agreeing is possible. But clearly, not enough progress has been made. One reason to this are status-related issues that may, from the outside, appear procedural, but are actually part of the core substance. Mr. President, Excellencies, during this week, the State Duma of the Russian Federation approved a resolution calling upon the Russian president to recognize independence of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This has caused questions and internal discussion within the TCG. While I know that the Duma resolution does not reflect the official line of the government, it is important to emphasize that all participants need to remain committed to the goal of restoring Ukraine's sovereignty over the totality of its territory. At the same time, the big context, the bigger picture, the unprecedented international focus on Ukraine and the region should be used as an opportunity to intensify, to unblock the work of the TCG. I am grateful for the recent high-level contacts between the leaders of the Normandy 4, as well as the two meetings of the Normandy 4 political advisors, and, for example, of the OSCE chairman in office discussions in Kiev and Moscow during the past days. These all could give new impetus to unblock TCG's work. They could, for example, to give us an opportunity to have and focus, to have substantial discussions on certain concrete draft laws at the very heart of the Minsk agreements. Finally, TCG has now met in video format in online meetings almost for 2 years. Meetings in video format lack drive and confidentiality. For several reasons, they do not offer possibilities for genuine negotiations and interaction. My goal remains to return to face-to-face meetings of our unique platform that does bring together Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, as well as representatives of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Кинунина за его брифинг. И сейчас я представляю слово его превосходительству господину Ешару Халиту Чевику.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to brief this Council today. In my capacity as the Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and as the Coordinator of the Working Group on Security Issues in the Trilateral Group, I will update you on key developments on the situation in eastern Ukraine during the past year. These include the security situation along the contact line, the impact of nearly 8 years of the conflict on civilians, and the SMM's increasingly challenging operational environment. The security situation remains fraught with tension. The gradual frame of the ceasefire I described to the Council last February has regrettably accelerated, and inevitably, civilians on both sides of the contact line continue to bear the burden of the tensions and resulting insecurity. I further have to note with deep concern that the impediments to the SMM's mandated freedom of movement have not only persisted, but escalated in the past year. In times of heightened tensions in and around Ukraine, when the mission's impartial and objective reporting is vital, these restrictions are especially unacceptable since they limit the mission's capabilities. The SMM has been vilified in public rhetoric, and mission members have at times been intimidated. Our technical monitoring tools are subjected to intense interference daily. The mission suffered temporary blockades of operations in Donetsk region last October. In Luhansk region, the SMM is also subjected to a blockade. SMM's sustainability is under risk as it has been deprived of its operational freedom and independence. In this context, I also wish to highlight my concern with the fact that the contact line remains exceedingly difficult to cross, both for SMM and civilians. It increasingly looks like and feels like a border, which it transects and divides families and communities and provision of services. Before elaborating on these developments, I wish to stress that in such challenging circumstances, the political will of the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire and reduce tensions is imperative. Silence along the contact line is of utmost importance for allowing space for negotiations. Abstaining from inflammatory public rhetoric is also essential. Mr. President, since I last briefed the esteemed Council, the overall security situation along the contact line in eastern Ukraine has remained volatile. After the unprecedented period of relative calm that followed the 22nd July 2020 Trilateral Contact Group Agreement on measures to strengthen the ceasefire throughout 2021, we saw a gradual but sustained increase in the level of armed violence. In 2021, between August and December in particular, the mission recorded high numbers of ceasefire violations, including increased use of heavy weapons that the sides had committed to withdraw, as well as their consequences in civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. In November, the SMM recorded levels of kinetic activity, including the more destructive weapons, worryingly close to those recorded prior to July 22nd measures agreement. At the 22nd December 2021 TCG meeting, the participants expressed strong determination to uphold the ceasefire regime. The first month following that meeting saw a considerable decrease in the level of violence by some 60%. But tensions nevertheless remain high, fueled also by the wider discussions surrounding the security situation in and around Ukraine. Of serious concern is the fact that in 2021, the SMM recorded ceasefire violations in and near the three symbolically important pilot disengagement areas, including with the use of proscribed weapons. In Luhansk region, in particular, the wider Pervomaisk-Popasna-Zolote area consistently remained a hotspot. On 3 December, the SMM recorded a violent exchange of fire inside and near the Stanitska-Luhansk disengagement and crossing point. This was an especially dangerous situation as civilians in transit, including children, were put at risk. This was the first time since April 2020 that SMM recorded ceasefire violations inside this area. Importantly, there, the benefits of this engagement had been clearly demonstrated as it allowed for the reconstruction of the Statitska-Luhansk bridge, one of the symbols of this conflict. I underline the significance of violence in these three areas as it provides insight into the side's will, or at times its absence, to adhere to their commitments. In this context, I also wish to share my deep concern over the side's holding of live fire exercises inside the security zone throughout 2021 and since the start of 2022. These ceasefire violations deserve our particular attention as they violate both the comprehensive ceasefire regime and the specific TCG decision of 3 March 2016 prohibiting the conduct of such exercises. Last month, they were approximately 10% of all ceasefire violations recorded by the SMM. Since the beginning of 2022, the mission is already recording on average twice as many ceasefire violations per day as it did over the same period in 2021, when the side's adherence to the ceasefire had already started fraying. As I noted, the increasing levels of violence with the use of heavy weapons inevitably led to a rise in the number of corroborated civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire. In 2021, the SMM corroborated more civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire 48 than those caused by mines and other explosive objects. Nearly 60% of the corroborated civilian casualties as a result of shelling and small arms fire, as well as nearly 70% of all cases of damage to civilian objects and the infrastructure sites were recorded between October and November last year. Other violations of commitments undertaken by the sites have also continued. The SMM recorded new trench extensions and improvements to positions, the presence of heavy weapons and military-type positions in residential areas, and the increased use of non-SMM unmanned aerial vehicles. As a last point on this issue, it is worth mentioning that violations occur on either side of the contact line. Mr. President, regrettably, discussions in the working group on security issues have been at an impasse for the past year. In principle agreements reached in 2020 on 19 demining areas, an updated mine action plan, 4 new disengagement areas, and a draft addendum to clarify some aspects of the framework decision on disengagement have not been actioned. The security-related conclusions of the 2019 Normandy 4 Paris Summit require new political impetus to be translated into tangible progress. Since April 2021, participants have been discussing a draft addendum to the 22nd July Measures Agreement, but common ground has yet to be found. As I underlined last year, such mechanism would facilitate the escalation, address the persistent issue of impunity, and contribute to building confidence on the ground. It will demonstrate the side's political will to act in line with their commitments. Mr. President, I wish to underline that the communities along the contact line are deeply traumatized by living in constant danger and uncertainty. I already mentioned the 48 casualties caused by small arms fire or shelling. In 2021, the SMM corroborated another 43 cases of people injured or killed by mines, unexploded ordnance, and other explosive devices. It is imperative that the sides do their utmost to mitigate these constant threats, even unilaterally, in parallel with the negotiations on overall solutions. Mr. President, the challenges of the ongoing pandemic have also endured and continue to make daily life even more challenging for civilians on both sides of the contact line. The past year saw no improvement in civilians' freedom of movement between the government and non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. Crossing the contact line remains limited to 2 of the 5 existing crossing points. Only the pedestrian crossing at Staniska Luhansk Bridge is accessible on a daily basis. There has been no progress in opening of the 2 new crossings at Zolote and Shastia, even though in principle agreement on their opening was reached in July 2020. Even as some of the pandemic-related restrictions were eased last year, official data shows that crossings in 2021 remain a mere 5% of the pre-pandemic levels. These are not just statistics, they represent the elderly who can no longer access their pensions, as well as the young who are losing out on educational and economic opportunities. Access to other services, including healthcare and documentation, such as passports, birth, and death certificates, is being severely curtailed, while people, family, friends, communities are being separated from each other. Estrangement between communities spanning the contact line should not become entrenched. The needs and the rights of civilians should take precedence. Both existing and new crossing points should be fully opened and all restrictions on both sides of the contact line lifted without delay. In these challenging circumstances, it is also vital that critical infrastructure that civilians depend on for their basic needs remain operational and protected from the impact of armed violence. Last year, the SMM continued facilitating and monitoring repairs to gas, water, and electricity infrastructure objects benefiting millions of civilians on both sides of the contact line. Regrettably, since February 2021, and especially in the wake of an incident inside the disengagement area near Zolote in October, the process of exchanging security guarantees among the sides has been at an impasse, particularly in Luhansk region. I would like to underline that the exchange of security guarantees, which are essential for conducting vital repairs, had previously not been linked to increased tensions on the ground. This process should not be politicized as it is done now. Mr. President, reviewing these challenges, it appears to me that there has never been a greater need for impartial and objective monitoring delivered by SMM. The sides also recognize the importance of the mission's work. Their reactions to the temporary relocation of some mission members last weekend clearly indicated that. Throughout the past year, the SMM has continued managing the challenges I described and performing its mandated tasks. However, since I last briefed this council, the mission's work has continued to be undermined by persistent and escalating constraints on its freedom of movement, predominantly in areas outside government control. I need to underline that freedom of movement is what makes monitoring as foreseen in the mandate. It is essential for enabling the SMM to serve as an impartial eye and ear of the international community in Ukraine. I wish to recall that this freedom of movement is a shrine in the mission's mandate as well as in Minsk agreements. In 2021, some 91% of all freedom of movement restrictions experienced by SMM took place in non-government controlled areas. The past year saw missions movements across the contact line increasingly denied, delayed, and conditioned. These impediments continued to undermine the SMM's operational unity and threaten the sustainability of its work in non-government controlled areas. Impediments to SMM's use of technical monitoring tools have also continued on both sides of the contact line. Instances of gunfire assessed as targeting SMM's unmanned aerial vehicles almost doubled. The intensity of GPS signal interference in 2021 reached unusually high levels. The degradation of our aerial environment in 2021 particularly affected the SMM's long-range railways. This platform is the only one that can monitor the full length of the contact line and the areas near the border outside government control 24/7 basis. However, over 80% of the flights encountered interference. Mr. President, the past year has been difficult on many levels. At a time of heightened tensions on the ground and in public rhetoric, it is imperative for the signatories of the Minsk agreements to adhere to all their commitments, first and foremost among them, to strictly adhere to ceasefire regime. Political impasse and increased violence reinforce one another. I hope that the recent resumption of the Normandy 4 consultations and other confidence-building efforts under the auspices of the OSCE will provide much-needed political impetus to relieve tensions in the region and for conflict resolution process to move forward. The restoration of SMM's freedom of movement is meanwhile paramount in order that the mission can do its job. The SMM should be actively supported by the sides in installing new cameras and opening long-planned forward patrol bases. The SMM should again be able to cross the contact line without arbitrary condition and denials. Its unimpeded and unconditional access through the contact line, especially in Luhansk region, must be restored without delay. Attempts to vilify the mission by public accusing it of bias should also come to an end. The impasse in exchange of security guarantees among the sides also requires urgent resolution all along the contact line. The capacity on the ground exists, the will to use it needs to be strengthened and be guided solely by the needs of the long-suffering civilians. The SMM remains available to facilitate constructive efforts in this regard. Mr. President, before concluding my remarks, I would like to highlight 2 points. I remain convinced that the SMM's role remains critical to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security. Yet, our key challenge has been to ensure the space for the implementation of that mandate. Lacking any way to enforce this implementation, we need the strong and sustained support of the international community to urge the sides to implement their commitments and restore SMM's freedom of movement. Where there is a political will, there is a way, and I remember particularly the reconstruction of the Stanitska-Luhansk bridge after so many years and the encouraging periods of quiet that briefly followed the July 22nd measures agreement. Progress is possible. I'm also compelled to highlight the continuing plight of civilians. I have described the death and injury caused by continued exchanges of fire and by mines. However, allow me to also note that with the contact line nearly completely sealed for 2 years already, people-to-people contacts have been greatly disrupted and communities, even families, have been divided due to no fault of their own. This is taking place against the background of other developments that are further deepening the divide between people living on both sides of the contact line. The political challenges of this 8-year conflict should not eclipse the human cost. I implore the signatories of the Minsk agreements to be mindful of these costs and redouble their efforts. I also urge the members of this venerable council to work with the sides and support their efforts to that end. If you allow me, Mr. President, I would also like to give some information about the developments of today's morning hours. Between yesterday evening and 11:20 Kiev today, Kiev time today, the SMM has recorded 500 explosions along the contact line. The wider areas of disengagement areas near Stanitska-Luhansk, Zolote were particularly kinetic. After 11:20, we have recorded about 30 explosions, so the tension may seem to be easy. During the early hours, around noon, the SMM has asked the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire commitments. It is critically important to de-escalate immediately to avoid further aggravation of the situation. SMM is aware and is following up on the reports of civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, and all along the contact line during the last 24 hours. We will continue to follow up the security situation as much as our resources allow, of course. The increased kinetic activity happened along roughly 200 kilometers of the contact line, basically on the Luhansk Oblast, and many SMM patrols are still returning and in the process of reporting. SMM patrols have visited the sites of the alleged damage to kindergarten and railway station in the government-controlled part of Stanitska-Luhansk. At the kindergarten, the SMM saw fresh damage to its facade. Of course, the details will be reported after all the corroboration effort has been completed, and we will do it as soon as possible because we are aware of the importance of these reports in reducing the tensions in the area. In Marinka and Karamchuk, where there were allegations, SMM itself didn't register ceasefire violations, and we are going to follow up. We are actually following up the allegations that reached to us. But it is important that the sides are called to reduce tensions and ceasefire, and also they do themselves being mindful of the high tensions in the region. I thank you very much.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Чевика за его брифинг. А сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Татьяне Монтян.
Thank you, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. This is the technician. Can you please unmute your microphone? Ma'am, your microphone is still muted. Please unmute your microphone.
У кого-то куда?
Слышно?
We can hear
Теперь
you now.
слышно, да? Еще раз добрый день, дамы и господа. Надеюсь, теперь меня слышно. Я внимательно прослушала все, что говорили ораторы до меня. И хочу вам сказать, что я абсолютно уверена, что вы все прекрасно знаете, что никогда киевские власти не собирались выполнять ни первые Минские соглашения, ни тем более вторые. Для них это был просто перерыв для того, чтобы сказать: да, мы выполним, а за это время Запад накачает нас оружием, укрепит наши вооруженные силы, и мы надеемся, что через некоторое время мы попробуем отбить мятежные республики силой. Они не то что не хотят разговаривать с республиками, и Зеленский сказал об этом прямо, вот прямо сейчас, что он не видит смысла разговаривать с Донецком и Луганском. Они не хотят разговаривать с гражданским обществом, даже внутри Украины. Люди, которые не собираются в Европу, в НАТО, которые против государственного переворота, которые хотят жить в мире и дружбе с Россией и со всеми остальными странами, не то что абсолютно не представлены в украинской политике, они преследуются в уголовном порядке. Я адвокат по уголовным делам. Мой клиент Руслан Кацаба просто записал видео на Ютубе, что он за мир, что он против войны на Донбассе. И с 2015 года его за это судят за государственную измену. Когда я лично поехала на Донбасс к одному из полевых командиров, ныне покойному Алексею Мозговому, чтобы забрать пленного из ВСУ, меня внесли на сайт «Миротворец», где находится огромное количество людей, вся вина которых только в том, что они за мир. Они против Майдана, против госпереворота, против НАТО и против Европы. И вы хотите мне сказать, что люди, которые судят простых обывателей за лайк в социальных сетях, скажем, гербу Советского Союза, недавно было такое дело, люди, которые закрыли все абсолютно оппозиционные каналы, которые преследуют всех оппозиционных политиков, они будут разговаривать с Донецком и Луганском. Абсолютно понятно, что это невозможно в принципе. Это как вещество и антивещество. Они взаимно аннигилируются. Казалось бы, в чем проблема в течение 5 лет дать особый статус? Но они не будут это делать, потому что они пресекают в Украине абсолютно любое инакомыслие. В Украине люди, которые против Майдана, госпереворота и против войны, это враги народа. Они не имеют права выступать нигде вообще. У них нет ни политических партий, ни общественных организаций. Они лишены права голоса в своей стране, просто лишены напрочь. И естественно, даже после этого вы хотите, чтобы киевский режим договаривался с Луганском и Донецком. Да я уверена, что вы понимаете, что этого не будет никогда, никогда, никогда. Один из предыдущих ораторов сказал, что якобы, несмотря на все усилия Германии и Франции, киевский режим не хочет выполнять Минские соглашения. Я уверена, что Запад позволяет киевскому режиму не выполнять Минские соглашения. Если бы это было не так, все эти Минские соглашения давно бы были выполнены. Не надо говорить, что Киев хоть сколько-нибудь самостоятелен, что Украина хоть сколько-нибудь независима. Это колония коллективного Запада, в которой все решают люди, которые пришли извне, которые устроили Майдан и госпереворот и захватили мою страну в рабство. И вот именно эти люди не дают исполнить Минские соглашения и не дадут. Я в этом уверена. Потому что истинная цель Запада, несмотря на все миролюбивые речи, которые я слышала в том числе и здесь, это натравить киевский режим на республики и втянуть Россию в войну. Абсолютно никакого объяснения западной истерии на тему, что Россия вот-вот нападет, и Байден это сказал буквально вот только что, я слышала как раз в процессе этого мероприятия. Других целей у Запада нет, только организовать войну. Если бы это было не так, то марионеточное правительство Украины давно было бы принуждено к исполнению Минских соглашений. А раз этого не происходит, значит, можно констатировать только одно. Запад хочет войны с Россией. И чтобы эта война происходила на территории Украины. Мы шахматная доска, а народ Украины и люди в непризнанных республиках — это просто разменная монета в геополитических играх. Больше нечего здесь сказать. И я уверена, вы прекрасно это знаете и понимаете. И я очень рада, что я смогла сказать вам это в лицо. Я уверена, что вы таки доведете до войны. Сегодняшние события с утра в республиках, когда они были обстреляны по всему периметру, по всей линии соприкосновения, окончательно меня в этом убедили. Украина, киевский режим в течение вот уже почти 8 лет обстреливает около 100 тысяч людей из тяжелой артиллерии. ОБСЕ, которые имеют прозвище на тех территориях слепые наблюдатели, вообще на это никак не реагируют. На стороне подконтрольной киевскому режиму не убивают детей, ни одного ребенка не было убито, не разрушают дома. Все это происходит только в непризнанных республиках. Я была там лично, я говорю не из чужих слов. Я проехалась по всей линии соприкосновения. Там убивают именно мирное население, самых беззащитных людей, которые не смогли оттуда уехать, потому что это или старики, или женщины с детьми, или инвалиды. Все, кто мог оттуда уехать, уехали оттуда уже очень давно. И вот именно эти люди, страдальцы и заложники там находятся, и их 100 тысяч человек. И вся Европа лицемерно и кровожадно смотрит 8-й год на страдания этих людей, не забывая при этом рассказывать, что Минские соглашения безальтернативны. так заставьте своих марионеток из киевского режима их исполнить. Или прекратите уже говорить, что они безальтернативны. Спасибо за внимание.
Монтян за ее брифинг. Сейчас я сделаю заявление в своем качестве заместителя министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации. Хотели бы поблагодарить за высказанные оценки заместителя генсекретаря ООН Розмари Ди Карло, спецпредставителя действующего председателя ОБСЕ в Минской контактной группе Мика Кинунина и главу специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ Халита Чевика. Признательны госпоже Татьяне Монтян за ценную весьма информацию из первых рук о том, как реализуется на практике решение Совета Безопасности ООН по урегулированию внутриукраинского конфликта. Дата сегодняшнего заседания выбрана нами не случайно. В этот день, 7 лет назад, Совет Безопасности ООН в своей резолюции 2202 единодушно утвердил комплекс мер по выполнению Минских соглашений в качестве единственной международно-правовой основы урегулирования гражданского конфликта на востоке Украины. Именно поэтому основной задачей сегодняшней встречи мы видим подтверждение Советом Безопасности безальтернативности этого судьбоносного для Украины документа. К сожалению, спустя 7 лет у нас появляется все больше оснований полагать, что реализация Минского комплекса мер в планы наших украинских соседей по-прежнему не входит. Они уже говорят об этом в открытую. Приведу лишь несколько наиболее свежих примеров. Буквально вчера вице-премьер-министр Украины Ирина Верещук утверждала, что никаких новых законов об особом статусе Донбасса, никаких согласований напрямую не будет. Это я цитирую. И это после разговора Зеленского с канцлером Шольцем. Она, кстати, тогда же призналась, что никакого давления со стороны Запада по выполнению Минска Киев не ощущает. 4 февраля в интервью украинскому телеканалу 1+1 Минотдел Украины Кулеба заявил, что Минские соглашения не могут быть выполнены на российских условиях, к которым он почему-то отнес прямой диалог между Украиной и Донбассом. Хотя это условие четко зафиксировано в комплексе мер. Эту же мысль проводил глава Офиса президента Украины Ермак на недавней встрече политсоветников в нормандском формате в Париже. Ранее, 2 февраля, Кулеба утверждал, что ни один регион Украины не будет иметь права вето на общегосударственные решения. Это высечено в камне, так что никакого особого статуса, как представляет Россия, никакого права вето не будет. Днем ранее, 1 февраля, Зеленский тоже напомнил всему миру о недоговороспособности Украины. Намекая на наличие альтернативного решения конфликта в Донбассе, он сказал, что в Киеве по-разному относятся к порядку выполнения тех или иных пунктов Минских соглашений. 31 января в интервью агентству Associated Press секретарь Совета национальной безопасности и обороны Украины Данилов заявил о том, что выполнение Минских соглашений означает разрушение страны. Когда они были подписаны под дулом русских пушек, а немцы и французы смотрели, всем разумным людям уже было ясно, что реализовать эти документы невозможно. Конец цитаты. Украинские политики последовательно пытаются укоренить на Западе мнение о том, что Минские соглашения противоречат интересам Украины. Но если задача построения мира на своей земле входит в национальные интересы Украины, подобных утверждений быть не должно. Другая распространенная отговорка подобного рода о том, что якобы некие свои обязательства по Минским соглашениям не выполняет Россия. Не исключаю, что подобные утверждения мы услышим и сегодня. При этом очевидно, что для такой постановки вопроса нет никаких оснований, так как упоминания России в тексте Минских соглашений нет. Приведу только одно мнение на этот счет, причем не кого-либо, а бывшего судьи Конституционного суда Украины Виктора Шишкина, который недавно предложил открыть уголовные дела против причастных к подписанию Минских соглашений Леонида Кучмы и Петра Порошенко. Последний обвиняется в том, что, цитирую, Минск предусматривает 20 обязательств для Украины, 6 для ОБСЕ, 2 для Донбасса и ни одного для России. Конец цитаты. Уважаемые коллеги, позвольте мне еще раз кратко напомнить содержание документа, которому посвящено наше сегодняшнее заседание. Перечислю его по пунктам. порядок выполнения которых четко прописан и не может быть изменен. Первое – прекращение огня. Второе – отвод вооружений. Третье – мониторинг ОБСЕ. Четвертое – начало диалога Киева с Донбассом. Пятое – амнистия. Шестое – обмен удерживаемыми лицами. Седьмое – гуманитарный доступ. Восьмое – отмена экономической блокады. Девятое – передача Киеву контроля над границей, если выполнен пункт 11. Десятое – вывод иностранных формирований и наемников. 11. Новая конституция, закрепляющая особый статус Донбасса. 12. Согласование порядка проведения выборов. И 13. Интенсификация работы контактной группы в Минске. Спустя 7 лет очевидно, ни одно из положений комплекса мер Украиной полноценно не выполнено. Начиная с первого пункта прекращения огня. Корень проблемы – систематическое нежелание Киева вступать в прямой диалог с полномочными представителями Донецка и Луганска в контактной группе. Это при том, что такой диалог прямо предусматривается пунктами 4, 9, 11 и 12 этого документа. Это не какое-то наше требование, а зафиксированное в документе обязательство Украины. И именно его наши соседи все громче ставят под сомнение, рискуя таким образом разрушить весь Минский процесс с губительными для Украины последствиями. Украина упорно отказывается от реализации положений комплекса мер о прямом диалоге с Донбассом, о порядке временного самоуправления, восстановления социально-экономических связей и проведения конституционной реформы для закрепления особого статуса региона. В настоящее время в Верховную Раду внесен несогласованный с Донбассом законопроект о децентрализации, не предусматривающий особого статуса региона. Украинская сторона взяла курс на полный отказ от прямого взаимодействия с Донбассом в рамках координационного механизма, предлагая различные варианты, не позволяющие эффективно реагировать на случаи нарушения режима прекращения огня. Попытки переложить ответственность на Россию, выставить ее стороной конфликта, несостоятельны и не имеют под собой никаких оснований. Не могу не сказать, что нас крайне разочаровывает, как минимум, страусиная позиция наших западных коллег, пытающихся не замечать эти очевидные вещи. Удивляет также, что, уводя в тень Минский комплекс мер, они делают акцент на работе в нормандском формате. Хочу напомнить, что нормандский формат, согласно приложению 2 резолюции 2202 Совета Безопасности ООН, является контрольным механизмом по выполнению Минских соглашений, а отнюдь не форматом согласования новых решений. На протяжении 7 лет Россия на всех возможных площадках призывала западных покровителей Киева надавить на своих подопечных для выполнения Минских соглашений. Вместо этого они занимались полностью противоположным. Растущее чувство безнаказанности и вседозволенности подстрекало горячие головы в Киеве на бесконечные новые отговорки и военные авантюры против собственного народа. В результате мы имеем то, что имеем. Тысячи жертв внутреннего вооруженного конфликта. Многомиллионное население Донбасса по-прежнему выставляется чужим в собственной стране. Против него направлены дулы автоматов, снайперских винтовок и гаубиц, нацелены ударные беспилотники. А украинские представители продолжают придумывать новые поводы не выполнять свои обязательства и отдавать приказы на расстрелы мирного населения. Вы знаете, что такое аллея ангелов? Это мемориальный комплекс в Донецке в память о детях, погибших от рук украинских военных. Таких, как те, которые погибли на детском пляже донбасского города Зугрес. 13 августа 2014 года он стал мишенью для ВВС Украины. В результате обстрела тогда погибли более 20 человек, десятки получили ранения. Местная жительница, 24-летняя Анастасия Рубан, была на том пляже вместе со своим 2-летним сыном Максимом, когда ВСУ начали обстрел города из ракетной системы залпового огня. Один из снарядов разорвался прямо рядом с ними. Вокруг было все в дыму, в крови, на земле лежали окровавленные тела детей, вспоминает девушка. Этот и многие другие подобные эпизоды собраны Следственным комитетом России и медиахолдингом РТ в подборке преступлений украинских военных с применением запрещенных средств и методов ведения войны. Наше представительство при ООН распространило вчера эти материалы среди государств-членов Совета Безопасности ООН. Попрошу посмотреть эти материалы. но я попрошу быть готовым, что вы увидите ужасные сцены. О том, как Киев привержен выполнению обязательств по комплексу мер, свидетельствует и похищение в октябре прошлого года наблюдателя от Луганска в совместном центре по координации и контролю Андрея Косяка. Господин Кинунен, был бы вам признателен за рассказ об этом эпизоде. Знаем, что этот вероломный поступок стал прямым нарушением пункта 5 комплекса мер, который запрещает преследование и наказание лиц в связи с событиями, имевшими место в отдельных районах Донецкой и Луганской областей Украины. Это я процитирую. Уважаемые коллеги, в завершении хотел бы выразить надежду, что представители западных стран удержатся от соблазна в угоду телекамерам превратить наше сегодняшнее заседание в площадку для безосновательных, агрессивных, словесных упражнений и вынести на него свои ничем не подтвержденные обвинения в том, что Россия якобы собирается напасть на Украину. Мне кажется, уже было достаточно спекуляций на эту тему, в том числе и на созванном США заседании Совета Безопасности 31 января. Мы давно уже все, что требовалось, пояснили и заявили. Объявленная дата мнимого вторжения уже прошла, поэтому, наверное, не надо ставить себя в неловкое положение. Благодарю вас за внимание. Я вновь приступаю к исполнению обязанностей председателя Совета. Сейчас я представляю слово Его превосходительству государственному секретарю Соединенных Штатов Америки господину Энтони Блинкену.
Mr. President, this council was convened today to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements, a goal that we all share, despite Russia's persistent violations. These agreements, which were negotiated in 2014 and 2015 and signed by Russia, remain the basis for the peace process to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This council's primary responsibility, the very reason for its creation, is the preservation of peace and security. As we meet today, the most immediate threat to peace and security is Russia's looming aggression against Ukraine. The stakes go far beyond Ukraine. This is a moment of peril for the lives and safety of millions of people, as well as for the foundation of the United Nations Charter and the rules-based international order that preserves stability worldwide. This crisis directly affects every member of this council and every country in the world. Because the basic principles that sustain peace and security, principles that were enshrined in the wake of 2 world wars and a Cold War, are under threat. The principle that one country cannot change the borders of another by force. The principle that one country cannot dictate another's choices or policies or with whom it will associate. The principle of national sovereignty. This is the exact kind of crisis that the United Nations, and specifically this Security Council, was created to prevent. We must address what Russia is doing right now to Ukraine. Over the past months, without provocation or justification, Russia has amassed more than 150,000 troops around Ukraine's borders, in Russia, Belarus, occupied Crimea. Russia says it's drawing down those forces. We do not see that happening on the ground. Our information indicates clearly that these forces, including ground troops, aircraft, ships, are preparing to launch an attack against Ukraine in the coming days. We don't know precisely how things will play out, but here's what the world can expect to see unfold. In fact, it's unfolding right now, today, as Russia takes steps down the path to war and reissued the threat of military action. First, Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real, attack using chemical weapons Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, making a mockery of a concept that we in this chamber do not take lightly, nor do I take lightly, based on my family history. In the past few days, Russian media has already begun to spread some of these false alarms and claims to maximize public outrage, to lay the groundwork for an invented justification for war. Today, that drumbeat has only intensified in Russia's state-controlled media. We've heard some of these basic allegations from Russian-backed speakers here today. Second, in response to this manufactured provocation, the highest levels of the Russian government may theatrically convene emergency meetings to address the so-called crisis. The government will issue proclamations declaring that Russia must respond to defend Russian citizens or ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Next, the attack is planned to begin. Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions. After that, Russian tanks and soldiers will advance on key targets that have already been identified and mapped out in detailed plans. We believe these targets include Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people. And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians. We've been warning the Ukrainian government of all that is coming. And here today, we are laying it out in great detail with the hope that by sharing what we know with the world, we can influence Russia to abandon the path of war and choose a different path while there's still time. Now, I'm mindful that some have called into question our information, recalling previous instances where intelligence ultimately did not bear out. But let me be clear. I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. The information I presented here is validated by what we've seen unfolding in plain sight before our eyes for months. And remember that while Russia has repeatedly derided our warnings and alarms as melodrama and nonsense, they have been steadily amassing more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, as well as the capabilities to conduct a massive military assault. It isn't just us seeing this. Allies and partners see the same thing. And Russia hasn't only been hearing from us. The international chorus has grown louder and louder. If Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, then we will be relieved that Russia changed course and proved our predictions wrong. That would be a far better outcome than the course we're currently on. And we'll gladly accept any criticism that anyone directs at us. As President Biden said, this would be a war of choice. And if Russia makes that choice, we've been clear, along with allies and partners, that our response will be sharp and decisive. President Biden reiterated that forcefully earlier this week. There's another choice Russia can still make if there's any truth to its claim that it's committed to diplomacy. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this crisis. An essential part of this is through implementation of the Minsk agreements, the subject of our session today. There are a series of commitments that Russia and Ukraine made under Minsk, with the OSCE and the Normandy format partners involved as well. If Russia is prepared to sit with the Ukrainian government and work through the process of implementing these commitments, our friends in France and Germany stand ready to convene senior-level discussions in the Normandy format to settle these issues. Ukraine is ready for this, and we stand fully ready to support the parties. Progress toward resolving the Donbass crisis through the Minsk agreements can reinforce the broader discussions on security issues that we're prepared to engage in with Russia, in coordination with our allies and partners. More than 3 weeks ago, we provided Russia with a paper that detailed concrete reciprocal steps that we can take in the near term to address our respective concerns and advance the collective security interests of Russia, the United States, and our European partners and allies. This morning, we received a response, which we're evaluating. Earlier today, I sent a letter to Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, proposing that we meet next week in Europe, following on our talks in recent weeks, to discuss the steps that we can take to resolve this crisis without conflict. We're also proposing meetings of the NATO-Russia Council and the OSCE Permanent Council. These meetings can pave the way for a summit of key leaders in the context of de-escalation to reach understandings on our mutual security concerns. As lead diplomats for our nations, we have a responsibility to make every effort for diplomacy to succeed, to leave no diplomatic stone unturned. If Russia's committed to diplomacy, we're presenting every opportunity for it to demonstrate that commitment. I have no doubt that the response to my remarks here today will be more dismissals from the Russian government about the United States stoking hysteria or that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. So let me make this simple. The Russian government can announce today, with no qualification, equivocation, or deflection, that Russia will not invade Ukraine. State it clearly, state it plainly to the world, and then demonstrate it by sending your troops, your tanks, your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and sending your diplomats to the negotiating table. In the coming days, the world will remember that commitment, or the refusal to make it. I yield the floor.
Я благодарю его превосходительство государственного секретаря США Антони Блинкена и предоставляю слово его превосходительству государственному министру по делам Европы и Северной Америки, Соединенного Королевства Великобритании и Северной Ирландии господину Джеймсу Клеверли.
I thank you, and I thank the briefers for the information they've given today. The United Nations, the OSCE, and the mandate of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission continue to command our full support. The rights of all Ukrainian, whether they are in Kyiv, Lviv, Donetsk, Luhansk, can only be served by peace, diplomacy, and dialogue. I want to make absolutely clear the United Kingdom's support for the implementation of the Minsk agreements as endorsed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. That resolution reaffirmed the Security Council's full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It remains the responsibility of all parties to implement fully their commitments and to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In this respect, we condemn the actions taken by the Russian Duma to propose the Russian president recognize the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. This would directly undermine the Minsk agreements and must be rejected by the Russian authorities in line with the commitments that they have made. We welcome all efforts to support the process and to avoid escalation, including the role of the OSCE and the Normandy format. This remains our long-standing position. Mr. President, let us remind ourselves of the context for the Minsk agreements and the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today. In March 2014, Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea in flagrant violation of international law. A few weeks later, in April, Russia instigated a conflict in the Donbass, which it continues to fuel today. More than 14,000 people have lost their lives in the fighting there. Now, today, the Ukrainian people are yet again living under the threat of invasion, with well over 130,000 Russian troops, heavy weaponry, and military vessels amassed and exercising on their northern, eastern, and southern borders, from Belarus to the Black Sea. Let us say clearly what the whole world can see. Russia has deployed the forces necessary to invade Ukraine and now has them readied for action. In the past days, we have heard Russian claims that some units are returning to barracks. It is, however, all too clear that the opposite is in fact true, and the Russian military build-up continues. Russia will say that it has the right to move its forces within its own territory, but no one has the right to threaten the use of force. Russia is patently failing to live up to the international commitments that it has made around military transparency by refusing to adequately explain its military build-up or provide the necessary transparency to build trust and to de-escalate the situation. If the Kremlin is serious about a diplomatic resolution, then it needs to show up to the diplomatic meetings and commit to meaningful OSCE talks, including via Chapter 3 of the OSCE Vienna document. They did not show up on Wednesday, and they do not intend to show up on Friday. Russia's actions are clearly designed to intimidate, to threaten, and to destabilize Ukraine. We know it, they know it, and the international community knows it. Mr. President, Russia called this meeting today to discuss Resolution 2202. That text is very clear on 2 points that reflect the core tenets of the Charter emphasized by the United Nations Secretary General when he addressed this situation only a few days ago. One, that resolving the situation in eastern regions of Ukraine can only be achieved by peaceful means. And two, that there must be full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Yet, we are seeing increasing disinformation about events in the Donbass that are straight out of the Kremlin playbook. A blatant attempt by the Russian government to fabricate a pretext for the invasion of Ukraine. It is therefore clear that we are at a critical juncture to prevent further escalation. Upholding the core tenets of the Charter in respect of peaceful resolution and respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity has never been more important. Russia must now engage with the diplomatic process we have built up over several decades and on which global security depends, and resolve this situation through peaceful means. If Russia chooses to launch an attack at this time of heightened tension, using disinformation of a pretext, it will show that Russia was never serious about diplomatic engagement. Any Russian invasion now would be a conflict of choice for President Putin and an abdication of Russia's responsibility under the UN Charter to refrain from the use of force and to maintain international peace and security. There should be no doubt that any further Russian incursion into Ukraine would be a massive strategic mistake and a humanitarian disaster that will be met with strength, including significant coordinated sanctions. And we will continue to call out the pattern of deception and disinformation from the Russian state. But if Russia is serious about the Charter and its role as a permanent member of this Council, it should give the Minsk agreements the chance to be implemented, free from coercion. It should engage seriously with diplomacy, and it should stand down all of its troops. There is still time to change path. Conflict can be avoided, and we urge Russia to match its words with actions, to withdraw its troops, to engage meaningfully in talks, and to act in the best interest of peace and security and stability in Europe. I thank you.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Клеверли за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Норвегии.
Thank you, President, and I thank the briefers for their statements. Let me also use this opportunity to thank all personnel at the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. They contribute on a daily basis to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security on the ground. The threatening security situation in and around Ukraine is alarming. Norway is deeply concerned by Russian large-scale military buildup in occupied Crimea to the north, east, and south of Ukraine, as well as in Belarus and the Black Sea. The alleged reports of increased shelling are disturbing. They must not be used as a pretext for any military action. Norway calls on Russia to de-escalate and to engage in dialogue constructively and in good faith through established international mechanisms. It remains a major obstacle that Russia falsely seeks to portray the conflict in eastern Ukraine as an internal Ukrainian conflict. The reality is that Russia has fueled the conflict by providing financial and military support to the armed formations it backs. President, Norway expresses strong concern regarding the resolution of the Russian State Duma calling for the recognition of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. We warn against such a step, which would constitute a further violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and directly contradict the spirit and the letter of the Minsk agreements. Norway supports the negotiations in the Normandy format and in the trilateral contact group aimed at ending the conflict through a political settlement and implementation of the Minsk agreements. Norway calls on the parties to uphold their commitments and to engage constructively towards resolving the conflict by peaceful means. We welcome the OSCE chairmanship's renewed European Security Dialogue initiative. We encourage Russia to engage in this format. We also urge Russia to respect its commitments under the Vienna document and contribute to a constructive dialogue and exchange under Chapter 3. Norway upholds a European security order based on international law and national sovereignty and territorial integrity. These principles have repeatedly been invoked by Russia in Council discussions. Norway calls on Russia to respect these principles when it comes to Ukraine. President, through threatening posture and rhetoric and unrealistic demands, Russia is challenging European security. Every country has the right to freely choose its security alignment. We cannot allow the established security architecture to be replaced by spheres of influence. We're concerned that the ceasefire in Donbass from July 2020 has become increasingly fragile. We call on the parties to seek a durable ceasefire and do their utmost to prevent civilian casualties. The humanitarian situation is severe after 8 years of conflict. Civilians are increasingly losing access to essential life-saving services as civilian infrastructure is damaged and destroyed. Any escalation of the conflict would lead to devastating humanitarian consequences. Let me conclude by reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders in accordance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. This includes the Crimean Peninsula and its territorial waters. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Норвегии за сделанное заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Бразилии.
Thank you. Mr. President, Brazil follows with concern the situation in eastern Ukraine. Persistent political stalemate and prolonged crisis have reached a critical point. In present circumstances, renewed and reinvigorated political resolve by all parties is crucial to address the conflict. Achieving and maintaining peace is our collective responsibility. We appreciate the ongoing political and diplomatic efforts aiming to restore peace and stability in Ukraine and the wider region. We firmly believe a diplomatic solution must be found to the crisis, and we will continue to support credible initiatives to bring a peaceful settlement to it. We reiterate our understanding that Resolution 2202 provides the general guidelines for a peaceful solution to the situation and a permanent stability in eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, Resolution 2202 has not been fully implemented. Brazil urges all parties to fulfill the letter and the spirit of the Minsk agreements. We urge concerned parties to pursue genuine dialogue on the implementation of Security Resolution 2202, which provides the parameters not only to address the situation in eastern Ukraine, but also to assist diplomatic efforts to overcome the current security challenges in the region. Brazil also welcomes the resumption of talks in the Normandy format and calls for renewed commitment to find ways for a lasting peace in eastern Ukraine. A comprehensive ceasefire, which is the first point of the Minsk agreements, remains an essential element in this process. Beyond that, we need further disengagement of forces and military equipment on the ground. This disengagement must allow unimpeded access of humanitarian relief to people in most desperate need. Furthermore, trust among relevant parties is crucial to strengthening dialogue and achieving a sustainable solution. Negotiations on the parameters to grant special status to certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions must be conducted with a sense of urgency, flexibility, and the spirit of compromise. The implementation of the Minsk agreements must observe full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. All parties must bear in mind the letter of the agreements. We firmly believe that the Security Council has the utmost responsibility to avoid and condemn any attempt of a military solution to this crisis. Dialogue and negotiation are the only way forward to a lasting peace. We urge all parties to take the necessary measures to de-escalate tensions and play a constructive role in reaching a political settlement to the Ukrainian crisis in accordance with international law, particularly the UN Charter. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Бразилии за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Ирландии.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I also want to say a special thank you to Under Secretary General De Carlo and to Ambassadors Kinnunen and Cevic today for their helpful and informative briefings. And I'd like to also recognise the presence of high-level participants at this Council this morning, Mr. President. As I begin my remarks, it's important that I'm clear. Ireland is a steadfast and consistent supporter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders. Ireland believes in and is fully committed to the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. These include the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. Ukraine has the same fundamental right as every other sovereign and independent state to choose its own foreign policy and to ensure the security and defence of its territory. That is a right we hold to be self-evident. It's the right that Ireland struggled to obtain. As Russia's military build-up at Ukraine's border continues to raise tensions, Ireland again calls for calm, de-escalation, and the pursuit of diplomacy. We need to see sustained and credible moves on the ground toward de-escalation. Genuine de-escalation will imply a significant withdrawal of both troops and equipment. We commend all who are engaged in dialogue, including through the Normandy format and Poland as OSCE chair in office, for launching a renewed European security dialogue. We support urgent, constructive and resolute engagement through all diplomatic channels. President, the full implementation of Minsk peace agreements and the related conflict resolution efforts in the Normandy format and trilateral contact group are important priorities for us. There is no doubt that we are now at a sensitive moment. Today, we call on all parties to act constructively within both formats. In this regard, we deeply regret the decision of the Russian State Duma to submit a call to recognize as independent entities the non-government controlled areas in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. This would be a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. We are also concerned at reports of alleged shelling today in eastern Ukraine, as mentioned by Special Representative Kinnunen, which would also be a violation of the Minsk agreements. Mr. President, all signatories of the Minsk agreements agreed on the need for the OSCE's special monitoring mission safe and secure access to the entire territory of Ukraine. The mandate of the SMM was agreed by all 57 OSCE participating states. We therefore remain very concerned at the continuing restrictions imposed on the SMM's freedom of movement. We also regret that SMM equipment has been damaged or interfered with. I want to express our deep regret at the decision by the Russian Federation to refuse to extend the mandate of the Border Observer Mission to monitor the border crossings. We commend the tireless efforts of Ambassadors Kinnunen and Cevic in the Trilateral Contact Group. We see the agreement reached by the group at the end of last year on adherence to the July 2020 ceasefire as an important achievement and a sign that there can be progress if there is genuine political will. President, Eastern Ukraine has already endured 8 years of conflict, resulting in humanitarian disaster, serious human rights violations, and abuses as reported by the OHCHR. Just as we know that further conflict is not inevitable, we know too that wherever conflict occurs, it is civilians who bear the brunt. Ireland therefore sincerely calls on all sides to work peacefully toward an effective and sustainable political settlement of the conflict, and to jumpstart that work today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю за заявление представителя Ирландии и предоставляю слово представителю Индии.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, Special Representative Mikko Kinnunen, and Chief Monitor Yashar Cevic for their comprehensive briefings on the occasion of the 7th anniversary of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements endorsed unanimously by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. I also welcome Ms. Tatiana Montian to our meeting. We welcome the efforts underway for implementation of the Minsk agreements, including through the Trilateral Contact Group and under the Normandy format. We believe that Minsk agreements provides a basis for a negotiated and peaceful settlement of the situation in eastern Ukraine. Accordingly, we urge all parties to continue to engage through all possible diplomatic channels and keep working towards the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also believe that meetings under the Normandy format will further facilitate the implementation of the provisions of the Minsk agreements, including its key security and political aspects. In this context, we welcome the recent meetings of the political advisors of the Normandy format countries in Paris and Berlin. We also welcome the unconditional observance of the July 2020 ceasefire, the reaffirmation of Minsk agreements as the basis of work under the Normandy format, and the commitment of all sides to reduce disagreements on the way forward. Any steps that increase tension may best be avoided by all sides in the larger interest of securing international peace and security. Quiet and constructive diplomacy is the need of the hour. India has been in touch with all concerned parties. It is our considered view that the issue can only be resolved through diplomatic dialogue. India's interest is in finding a solution that can provide for immediate de-escalation of tensions, taking into account the legitimate security interests of all countries and aim towards securing long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond. More than 20,000 Indian students and nationals live and study in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. The well-being of Indian nationals is of priority to us. In conclusion, we reiterate our call for the peaceful resolution of the situation by sincere and sustained diplomatic efforts to ensure that concerns of all sides are amicably resolved through constructive dialogue. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Индии за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Кении.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Special Representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission Chief Monitor for their briefings. Kenya cannot contemplate the continued insecurity in eastern Ukraine and the impact it can have on broader security in Europe. Global security is intertwined. Instability in Europe, beyond threatening lives and economies, also disrupts the ability of this important region to play a constructive role in solving the most pressing challenges globally. Insufficient progress in the implementation of the Minsk agreements has been realized since 2014, and that needs to change. Kenya wants to offer 3 brief recommendations. In doing so, we hope that they will contribute to a renewed push by all relevant stakeholders to stabilize a situation that, left to escalate, threatens the very foundations of global stability and the Security Council's ability to fulfill its mandate in multiple conflict situations. First, Kenya maintains that the respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries by all states is a cornerstone of global peace. If multilateralism is to be reborn into a system that delivers sustained peace to all, the most powerful states must consistently adhere to international law and to the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in all regions at all times. We therefore strongly urge all actors to respect the peace, security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine deserve inclusive governance, peace, and a vibrant economy, which are all deeply dependent on regional stability and cooperation. Second, as we indicated on the 31st of January in this chamber, we believe that this standoff is imminently solvable. Major military powers, particularly those represented in the Security Council, must make a specific and sustained effort to reach arrangements that deliver a minimum level of deconfliction and mutual respect. Otherwise, third countries and global peace and security will suffer greatly as a result of their confrontations. Third, Kenya reiterates the obligations of all the parties to fully implement their commitments in accordance with the Minsk agreements, which provide the most promising roadmap for the peaceful settlement of the current hostilities, including in eastern Ukraine. All parties must take responsibility and reflect that responsibility in a new willingness to agree to compromise. Kenya welcomes the Normandy Format Advisors meeting held earlier this month and the follow-up meeting, which is scheduled for next month, on implementing the Minsk Accords and the consensus reached at the Group Leaders Summit in Paris in December 2019. We commend the diplomatic leaders of the Russian Federation and the United States and their partners and allies for showing a willingness to meet in the coming days to make further progress. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя Кении за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أود بداية أن أشكر كلا من السيدة روزماري دي كارلو وكيلة الأمين العام للشؤون السياسية وبناء السلام، والسيد ميكو كينونن الممثل الخاص للرئيس الحالي لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا في أوكرانيا، ومجموعة الاتصال الثلاثية، والسيد ياسر هالتشافيك رئيس بعثة الرصد الخاصة التابعة لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا، على إحاطاتهم الشاملة. كما استمعنا إلى إحاطة ممثل المجتمع المدني السيدة تاتيانا مارتيان. السيد الرئيس، منذ اجتماعنا الأخير في 31 من يناير شهدنا بذل المزيد من الجهود الدبلوماسية على مختلف المستويات، بما فيها على أعلى المستويات لخفض التوترات القائمة في أوروبا الشرقية. كما نرحب بمحادثات هيئة نورماندي ونأمل أن تستمر. فمثل هذه المناقشات المنظمة، ولا سيما تلك التي تجمع بين روسيا وأوكرانيا وباقي الأطراف المعنية، مهمة لتعزيز الحوار وتخفيف حدة التوترات، ومن شأنها أن تساهم في إيجاد حل سلمي مستدام يعالج كافة الشواغل الأمنية لجميع الأطراف. وعلي تؤكد بلادي على ضرورة الحفاظ على الزخم الحالي للجهود الدبلوماسية وتعزيزها، لا سيما من خلال اتخاذ جميع الأطراف المعنية الخطوات اللازمة للانخراط في حوار بناء بما يخدم وقف التصعيد ويحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين. ونرى هنا أهمية تنفيذ اتفاقات مينسك بشكل تام وبحسن نية من قبل جميع الأطراف، ونشير كذلك لقرار مجلس الأمن 2202. وفي هذا السياق نحث جميع الأطراف المعنية على تجنب اتخاذ خطوات قد تزيد من صعوبة تنفيذ هذه الاتفاقات. كما نشير إلى الدور الهام لبعثة الرصد الخاصة إلى أوكرانيا التابعة لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا، حيث يعتبر وجودها داعماً لجهود الحوار وبناء الثقة بين الأطراف، كما يسهم في تخفيف حدة التوترات. وفي الوقت ذاته علينا إلى أهمية للوضع الحرج للمدنيين في شرق أوكرانيا، حيث أفادت تقارير الأمم المتحدة أنه يوجد 3.4 مليون شخص بحاجة لتلقي المساعدات الإنسانية، منهم 55% من النساء و16% من الأطفال. كما توجد تحديات تتعلق بإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية لبعض المحتاجين، لا سيما في المناطق القريبة من خط النزاع في شرق أوكرانيا. وعليه نشدد على أهمية عدم التصعيد في التوترات القائمة لما قد تلحقه من أضرار خطيرة على المدنيين. ونهيب في هذا الشأن بجميع الأطراف على أهمية عدم التعرض للمساعدات الإنسانية وللمدنيين في مناطق النزاع، بما يتماشى مع التزاماتهم بموجب القانون الدولي. وأخيراً نكرر التأكيد على أهمية احترام القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، وعلى وجه الخصوص مبادئ السلام الإقليمية والسيادة وحسن الجوار، باعتبارها مرجعاً أساسياً لحل الأزمة القائمة وتهدئة التوترات في المنطقة. وختاماً، السيد الرئيس، تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية اللجوء للحوار البناء ومواصلة العمل لإيجاد حلول سلمية تتسق مع القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وشكراً السيد الرئيس.
Я благодарю представителя Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Ганы.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing on the prevailing situation in eastern Ukraine as it relates to the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, as well as Mr. Mikko Kinnunen, the Special Representative of the OSCE, Chairperson in the office in Ukraine and the Trilateral Contact Group, and Mr. Yasser Halit Shevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, for highlighting the efforts of the OSCE in facilitating the political and diplomatic settlements of the the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We have taken note also of the views expressed by Ms. Tatiana Montian, a civil society representative from Ukraine. I further welcome the participation of the representatives of Germany and Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, in welcoming today's discussion, which enabled the Council to take stock of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, adopted on 12 February 2015, my delegation recalls the adoption of Resolution 2202, wherein the Security Council expressed its firm conviction that the crisis in the eastern regions of Ukraine could only be settled through peaceful means. 7 years after the adoption of Resolution 2202, the Council's obligation for the maintenance of international peace and security requires of it a reiteration of its conviction and support for the processes for the further implementation of the Minsk Agreement. Unfortunately, the Minsk Agreements remain largely unimplemented, and the conflict continues to fester in parts of the Donbas region, with increasing civilian casualties and deepening vulnerabilities, mostly of elderly persons and women-led households. More than 14,000 deaths have been recorded since the conflict in eastern Ukraine began. Several thousands of people have been displaced, and 2.9 million people are presently in need of humanitarian assistance. The implications of the situation in Ukraine on regional as well as international peace and security have also been dire. While recognizing the complex fears and complicated concerns which have been expressed by the parties through the Minsk Agreement, we nonetheless believe that good faith conformity with Charter obligations by concerned member states should provide clarity to seize opportunities for supporting continuing dialogue and the engagements required to address the concerns of all parties. In this respect, Ghana is concerned by the increasing tensions along the borders of Ukraine. We recall in this regard the provisions of the Charter which establishes the fundamental norms of the post-1945 international order and require that the international relations of member states should not involve threats of or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. We therefore entreat all parties to maintain the path of dialogue and diplomacy in addressing any differences that exist between and among them. Towards the further implementation of peaceful measures for resolving the crisis in the eastern regions of Ukraine, we make the following points. First, Ghana reaffirms her support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders. Secondly, we know the security concerns of other member states in Europe, especially those in Eastern Europe, and urge a restraint by all in maintaining the Pacific order in Europe, even as efforts continue to address any concerns with the contemporary European security architecture. Third, we welcome the high-level diplomatic engagements to address existing concerns over the situation in Ukraine, including recent discussions among leaders of the Normandy IV that reaffirmed the ceasefire in the eastern region of Ukraine, as well as the OSCE facilitated dialogues at different levels. We continue to urge restraint by all sides, call on the parties to bear in mind the prospective outcomes from ongoing escalation, which do not lead to any strategic gain for any party, and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. Fourth, we urge renewed dialogue within the Normandy IV process to resolve differences in the interpretation of the sequencing of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. As it is said, how can two go on a journey unless they be agreed on the path they intend to take? Fifth, we urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas in line with humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. We further commend the efforts of humanitarian agencies in Ukraine and welcome the 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan to save lives, ensure access to basic services, and strengthen the protection of those affected by the conflict and COVID-19. Finally, Mr. President, let me conclude by stressing Ghana's support for the renewal of the spirit of the Minsk Agreement. We urge the parties to work in good faith and with flexibility to make necessary concessions for an enduring peace in Ukraine with beneficial outcomes for the rest of the Europe and indeed globally. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Благодарю представителя Ганы за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Мексики.
Gracias, presidente. Agradezco las presentaciones de la subsecretaria Di Carlo, del representante especial Kinnunen y del embajador Chevik, y tomamos nota de los comentarios de la señora Montián. Reconocemos la presencia de distinguidos participantes de alto nivel en esta sesión y damos la bienvenida a los representantes de Ucrania y de Alemania. La revisión por parte de este Consejo del estado que guardan los acuerdos de Minsk relativos a las regiones de Luhansk y Donetsk en Ucrania Oriental se da en el contexto de fuertes tensiones que han generado una gran preocupación en la comunidad internacional. Por ello, pensamos que es urgente, ante todo, mandar una señal clara, inequívoca, de la voluntad de las partes que permita revertir la escalada de tensiones y ceda espacio a la negociación política, una vía que contemple tres elementos: distensión, diplomacia y diálogo. Hemos tomado nota con gran interés del anuncio sobre el retiro de algunas tropas de la frontera con Ucrania. Concretarlo a la brevedad generará la confianza que solo dan los hechos y que las circunstancias reclaman. En tanto que la única solución real es una solución diplomática, damos la bienvenida a la disposición que han mostrado los distintos actores por continuar por la vía del diálogo. México reconoce y agradece los esfuerzos de los líderes mundiales que, siendo factores de influencia, se han involucrado personalmente para tratar de encontrar una salida pacífica a esta crisis que sea capaz de atender las diversas preocupaciones de seguridad en la región. Cualquier solución implica poner fin a las tensiones en el este de Ucrania. A 8 años del inicio del conflicto, los acuerdos de Minsk son el marco para alcanzar una solución negociada. El grupo trilateral de contacto y el formato de Normandía ofrecen esa posibilidad. Como hemos escuchado, el conflicto en Ucrania Oriental ha tenido un grave impacto en la población civil. Se estima que cerca de 3 millones de personas requieren de asistencia humanitaria, mientras que alrededor de 1,5 millones de personas se encuentran desplazadas. La población también enfrenta restricciones en su libertad de movimiento, lo cual limita el acceso a los servicios de salud y de educación. México pide que se garantice la libertad de movimiento de los civiles en ambos lados de la línea de contacto. Hacemos un llamado también a las partes a facilitar el acceso humanitario en la zona de manera segura e irrestricta, así como garantizar el libre movimiento a la misión de observación de la Organización para la Seguridad y la Cooperación Europea, lo cual es esencial para la cabal ejecución de su mandato. También es necesario destacar que las minas, las municiones no detonadas y otros artefactos explosivos son una amenaza real y afectan sobremanera a la población civil. Exhortamos a las partes a eliminar las minas existentes y a no incurrir en la colocación de nuevos explosivos. Señor presidente, México reitera su compromiso con el respeto a la soberanía, la independencia política y la integridad territorial de Ucrania dentro de sus fronteras reconocidas internacionalmente de conformidad con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, el derecho internacional y las resoluciones pertinentes de las Naciones Unidas. Concluyo resaltando que las tensiones alrededor de la situación en Ucrania y sus potenciales consecuencias hacen evidente lo que tan claramente se ha señalado de distintas maneras. Reemplazar la diplomacia por la confrontación implicaría dar un gran salto al vacío. Es hora de refrendar los esfuerzos en un solo camino, el de la distensión, la diplomacia y el diálogo. Gracias, presidente.
Я благодарю представителя Мексики за сделанное заявление и теперь предоставляю слово представителю Китая.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，我感谢你主持今天的会议，感谢迪卡洛副秘书长、欧安组织轮值主席特别代表基努恩大使、欧安组织特别观察团首席监察员切维克大使的通报。我也认真听取了民间社会代表芒田女士的发言。今年2月12日是新明斯克协议达成7周年，审议新明斯克协议的落实情况